looking at market structures, different ways in which the market that the product is being exchanged in is put together. That is, how many consumers are there? How many producers are there? What's the nature of the interaction that makes this market happen? Now, in the first lesson, we looked at the model of perfect competition, where there were lots of buyers and sellers. There was the same product, undifferentiated product. There was full information about technology, information about price, information about product quality. Everybody understands what they're getting, how they can make it most effectively. All that information is available to all of the participants. And we assumed that entry into this particular market was relatively costless, and it's easy to get out as well as easy to get in. Now, those conditions don't apply to all markets. They apply to a lot of markets, and certainly a lot more markets now that we've got internet marketing and shipping available. You can buy from companies that are way outside of town. You don't have to go to the brick and mortar anymore. It's changing the whole understanding of what these markets are, except that it's pretty much making them more competitive. There are some examples in which that's not happening, but most markets are becoming more competitive in the sense that there are lots more sellers and lots more buyers. Not so much more competitive in the sense of the particular sellers intentionally trying to drive other sellers out of the market and destroy them. Now, if a seller is not efficient, then a more efficient seller is likely to be able to charge a lower price, and the less efficient seller will leave the market. We studied that in this perfect competition environment. But that's a function of the one firm doing really well and the other firm doing less well, and not necessarily indicative of intent to destroy the other firm, right? Okay, so when we talked about the application of Christian themes, the understanding of these market structures really helps us think about which of those themes is best applicable. So we learn from the economics how to use the Christian theological tools to really interpret what's going on in the marketplace. For this particular lesson, we're going to turn to some of those other market structures that are out there. The market structures that are out there include the perfectly competitive markets. Some markets have monopolies. Some have a relative few suppliers. They're called oligopoly. And then there's the monopolistically competitive market that we'll get to next time. Now, under what condition does a firm have market power? And now here, market power is not market power to destroy the other firms. Market power here is defined as the ability of this particular company, this particular firm, to be able to set a price that does not mean that all of its customers run away. Remember, in the perfectly competitive market, if they set a price higher than that equilibrium market price, nobody would buy from them. They'd just go next door and buy the product from somebody else. So under what conditions would the consumers stay and pay even the higher price and not go next door? Well, some of those conditions include clearly differentiable product. If your particular kind of refrigerator or the tables that you make are noticeably different, and the value that different consumers place on these goods, okay, is different, then you might be able to charge a price higher for your refrigerator than somebody else can charge for theirs. If the consumer sees a difference in the product and is willing to pay for it, you could be able to raise the price for your particular good. Certainly, if there are legal barriers to competition, that's a source of market power, a source which enables the firm to be able to charge a price higher than it otherwise would in a competitive environment. If the firm has come up with some new way of creating the good that is a patented technology, a patent means that other people can't use that particular technology without paying the patent holder because somebody went to the trouble to come up with the idea. And to encourage people to come up with new ideas, our society has established patent law as a way of saying, okay, for a certain period of time, not forever, but for a certain period of time, if you come up with a new lower cost way of making your tables, then you can use that and you can keep other people from using that particular technology, at least for a period of time. That enables you to gain some above normal profits for having had the better idea. Eventually, that patent runs out. And once that patent runs out, other companies can then begin producing using that technology, and your profits will get squeezed because this just turned into a competitive environment. But for that period of time, the additional profits you make come from your having had a good idea, a way of either creating more value in the product or being able to create the product at lower resource cost. Those ideas are valuable, and in the United States, you can have a right to that idea for a period of time, get paid for it. That gives incentives for people to come up with new and better ideas. It also may turn out that some types of production have what we call economies of scale and economies of scope. Now, when we were talking about the cost structures for firms, we talked especially about economies of scale, where the additional production actually leads to a lowering in that average total cost because we learned something about how to produce. We are able to employ other technologies at high levels of output that we can't apply at low levels of output. They're relatively expensive fixed costs, high fixed cost technologies that if I'm able to take that technology and use it for lots of units, I can spread those fixed costs across lots of units and the per unit cost gets lower. So there are some production economies out there. If my firm has already expanded and is able to take advantage of those economies of scale, a new entrant into this market functioning at a smaller scale is going to have higher per unit costs and may not be able to compete. I can keep my prices lower because my costs aren't as high. I'm more efficient at scale, and the smaller firm isn't able to cover their costs. That means that I don't have to charge only the cost of production. I could charge a price a bit higher than that, and the other companies still can't match it. Those production economies give me a certain amount of market power, the ability to charge a price above unit costs that generates for me economic profits. Additionally, if my organization has access to very specialized resources, okay, whether that's a set of people who know how to do something that nobody else knows how to do, or a control over some sort of physical resource. If I happen to control all of the titanium deposits in a country, then nobody else can get the titanium and produce the products that need titanium to be produced. So if I have control over those strategic inputs, then I'm able to have a cost structure that's lower than other people who can't get the inputs and they're not able to compete. That means that I'm able to charge a price above costs. That is, I have a certain amount of market power to be able to generate economic profits by virtue of the fact of having that control over those resources. And absolutely, we have to understand that some firms gain market power by trying to destroy other firms. Some firms may collude to try to take advantage of the customers. Some firms may choose to drop their prices for a period of time to drive other firms out of business. Once those firms have left, if it's hard to re-enter, then the predatory firm is able to raise their prices back up and then generate economic profits, having destroyed the competition. Now, those stories of things like predatory pricing, okay, need to be understood as, yes, that happens once in a while, but that is not the normal terms of business for most industries in a competitive market environment. Okay? It does happen. When it happens, we'll need to evaluate the conditions and discuss certainly the moral and the social implications of those kinds of anti-competitive strategies. Okay? We'll get to some of that in a bit. Now, does it matter? Does it matter that there's a monopoly in a particular industry? Well, let's consider the eyewear industry in the United States. There's a company called Luxottica, and Luxottica actually produces and sells about 3/4 of all of the eyewear in the United States. Now, you might not have heard of Luxottica, but in fact, Luxottica owns those brands called Ray-Ban and Oakley and a number of other high-end eyewear brands. They produce under license to use the name for Armani and Bulgari and Michael Kors and a lot of other very high-end names. Luxottica produces all of that eyewear under these different names, but Luxottica, the one company, is producing it all. So it may look like Ray-Ban is competing with Oakley, but in fact, the one company is able to keep the price of both of those goods high so that as people look at, gee, should I buy Ray-Ban or should I buy Oakley? Well, Oakley might be a little bit less expensive. Maybe I should buy the Oakley. Well, the fact that Oakley is a little bit less expensive is not an indication of competitive pressure. It's an indication that this particular company is segmenting its market and keeping all of its prices high. If that's not enough, this particular company owns LensCrafters and Pearl Vision, a couple of the largest optical retail businesses in the United States and other places in the world, some of the largest optical retail businesses in those places as well. If you think, oh, well, I'll just go buy some sunglasses, I'll go to Sunglass Hut, guess what? Luxottica owns Sunglass Hut as well. Well, fine, I'll go to Sears or Target where, I'm bound to find, stuff for less. Well, fine, accept that. Luxottica also owns and operates those retail brand eyewear outlets as well. So, oh, well, I just pay through my insurance. Well, guess what? One of the largest vision care networks that's expanding in the United States is also owned by Luxottica. there are a few competitors, 20-25% of the market, where is being supplied by some other producers of eyewear. Costco actually sells product produced by non-Luxottica producers. Certainly Warby Parker, that you may be familiar with, is not owned by Luxottica. But those competitors control a very small portion of the market compared to this one firm. Lots of different brands, but the prices are able to be kept high because there aren't an awful lot of competitors to drive the price down. This monopoly over eyewear in the United States, and in fact, a large portion of the global market, if you want to read more about, they lay it out for you on their own website at luxottica.com. So let's figure out how it is that a monopoly is able to maintain this economic profit, to utilize its market power over time to generate more profits than a firm in competition can. Remember from last time, we were talking about that perfectly competitive kind of market where there might be short-run profits or loss, but because that profit or loss is evident to everybody in the industry, there may be firms that would enter if the profit is above normal profit, or leave if the profit is below normal profit. That changes the supply conditions, changing the market price. And in the long run, highly competitive markets generate not no profit at all for anyone, but no economic profit, not above and beyond the profit made in any other industry. The decisions about who's going to join this market or who's going to leave this market depend on the structure of fixed costs for the individual firms. And then the ultimate result from the perfectly competitive markets is that we get lots of stuff being produced by lots of different firms, all producing at low average cost of production. Now let's compare that to a condition of monopoly. Now, if a single seller of the good, lots of buyers, but this time we're going to have just a single seller. Now, what is the shape of the demand curve that the single seller would face? Well, in fact, the seller faces the entire market demand curve. Remember, the individual firm in competition faces a horizontal demand curve for the individual firm. That is, they can sell as many units as they choose to sell at the market price. Here, if the firm raises the price, the quantity demanded would decline. If this firm lowers the price, the quantity demanded would expand, but it wouldn't change to completely zero if the price went up. There is an elasticity here of demand that this firm faces that individual firms in competition don't face. Okay? If the price goes up, not everyone is going to immediately leave this market because this is the only seller of the good. Some people will leave. Some people will say the price is too high for them now, but others value the goods at even more than the new higher price. Another assumption for this monopoly is that it's not easy for other competitors to enter in. And remember, we talked about what are some of the sources of market power. There may be some patents around or control over strategic resources that keep other firms from being able to enter and also supply the good in this marketplace. The single seller can therefore set the price. Now, it's important to remember that when that single seller sets the price, they don't also get to set the quantity. The argument that monopolists can set any price they want is misplaced, because the monopolist can set any price they want, but at whatever price they set, they have to accept the quantity that the consumers would then choose to buy. That is, they face a market demand curve. Certainly, if the monopolist got to charge a high price and say you have to buy all of these units of the good, certainly that would give extraordinary power to the monopolist. But most monopolists aren't quite that way. Most monopolists face some elasticity, some ability of the consumer to do without. It might be inconvenient for the consumer to do without, but they could do without. Now, there certainly are some products that have very highly inelastic demand. That is, you raise the price and people's choice for, say, life-saving drug therapies. If the price goes up, there isn't an awful lot of choice for most people. They either pay the higher price or they don't get the drug and their health condition deteriorates rapidly. There are those kinds of conditions, and certainly the society imposes restrictions on monopoly conditions, especially for those markets with very high inelasticities, like drug products. But okay, the fact that the monopolist could charge very high prices doesn't tell the whole story when consumers can choose to not buy the product. Those are the kinds of monopoly environments that we want to take a deeper look at. Now remember that the marginal revenue for the perfectly competitive firm is just equal to the market price. Each additional unit that the company would sell, they would generate that additional price and the price for another table and a price for another table and the same price for another table. In the condition of monopoly, if you try to push more quantity into the market, the overall market price falls. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to give you the choice as a monopolist. You can sell either quantity number one or quantity number two. Now, suppose that you choose to sell quantity number one. Well, that quantity number one corresponds to a price, price one. And for that, you'll get a certain total revenue. That's price times quantity is how we calculate total revenue. So the total revenue is, well, in the graph, it's just the area of the box. The total revenue that you get from choosing to produce Q1, at Q1 you'll sell it for P1 and you'll generate that as your total revenue. Suppose instead you choose to produce at a level of output Q2. Well, at a level of output Q2, you can't sell all those units at P1 as well. In fact, you wind up having to choose either to sell Q1, say 100 units at price 1, or 110 units, Q2, at a price P2 that's lower. You either sell them all at P1 or sell all of Q2 at P2. Right? This isn't sequenced. You don't sell some at this price and some at the other. We'll look at that as a special case, possibly toward the end. But the choice that you face is to produce and sell Q1 at whatever price the market will pay for Q1, or to produce Q2 and sell all of those units at whatever price the market will pay for those. Okay? The total revenues that would be generated if you chose to produce a Q2 would be the blue box. Now, what's the difference? What's the marginal revenue? The additional revenue you get for increasing quantity from Q1 up to Q2, the additional revenue you get is not P2 for each of those additional units. because in order to get out to Q2, you had to, compared to producing at Q1, drop your price on Q1 units from that higher price down to P2. So you give up some revenue to get some other revenue. So the difference is the marginal revenue. And the additional revenue you'd get from producing at a level of output Q2 would be the difference in revenue between the two. So in our graph, what we do would be to take that little green area and subtract it off of the additional blue. What's left then of that additional blue area, that's our marginal revenue. That's the addition to revenue from having produced those additional units of output. And if we do that for every additional amount of output, we can graph out our marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. And that marginal revenue curve, notice, unlike in perfect competition, that marginal revenue curve has fallen down off of the demand curve. Remember, the marginal revenue curve was laying right on top of it. It was the individual firm demand curve in competition. Not so in monopoly. Our marginal revenue curve is down below, has fallen off of, swung down off of that demand curve. So what kind of decisions is a monopolist going to make? Remember, a monopolist can choose any price, but they won't. They won't choose just any price. They will choose the price that maximizes their profits. And just like any other firm. And that profit maximizing condition is still when the marginal revenue, the additional revenue you get from producing another unit of the good, is above the marginal cost, keep producing. Once the marginal cost is above the marginal revenue, don't produce that one. That one would lose money on that and it would reduce the overall profits that you're looking at building up in the first place. So the point here is where the marginal revenue equals marginal costs. That determines in a monopoly the quantity that the firm should produce. The firm produces that quantity and then takes that quantity to the market. The price is not down there at the red dot. That intersection of marginal cost equals marginal revenue just gives us the quantity. And in monopoly, we take that quantity to the market and say, hey folks, here's how many units there are, what price are y'all willing to pay? And the people who value the goods highly say, we'll pay a high price, and the folks who don't value the goods as much say, well, we'll pay a lower price. And the question is, how many people value those goods that are being presented to them, and where's the price? Well, the price is read right off of that demand curve. So the monopoly price is determined by find the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That gives you the quantity. Then take the quantity up to the demand curve to find the monopoly price. Okay, is that clear? To calculate how much profit that really yields the monopolist, well, again, what's the price that they receive for every unit, and what's the cost on average for every unit? We calculate this the same way we did back in the perfectly competitive case. The gap between the price received and the average cost per unit of producing that many units of the good. Here, quantity is equal to 9. That was where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We're just kind of reading it off the graph in this case. So we'll say that the quantity is 9, and we took that up to the demand curve, and we read off a price of $260. So together, that means that the profit would be $260 minus the average cost of production, which at that 9 units of output, we read off the average total cost curve. So we read it off as 160. So the difference, the $100, is profit per unit times the 9 tables that we would choose to produce. That's $900 of profit for the monopolist. So there's $900 of profit to be made as a monopolist in this particular market. And remember, because there's some barrier to entry keeping other firms from entering in and driving down the prices, this monopolist is able to generate that $900 in profit period after period after period. Well, let's compare the consequences of there being a monopoly to what if there wasn't a monopoly in this world. Let's suppose that the firms all together were able to supply according to what's shown here for that one big monopolist as the marginal cost curve. Remember, the individual marginal cost curves are what add up to be the supply curve in the whole market in the perfectly competitive case. So here we've got this marginal cost curve representing the market supply. Bring that together with the market demand. If this was a competitive market, then the quantity would be where the supply is equal to the quantity demanded. And that, in this case, is at a quantity of 13. And if we take that quantity of 13 to the market, there's the demand that says, well, the price is going to be 180. Well, remember that there's the amount that then is this total created value, the value to the customer in excess of the costs that are required to make those units of the good. The consumer gets the consumer surplus part of that. Remember from chapter 2, we talked about the consumer surplus being the value received in excess of the price paid by the consumers. So we look at each of the individual units and we add up that value received. They were willing to pay according to the demand curve. They only had to pay 180. So that triangle represents the value that the consumers get to keep when they engage with this market. And the producer surplus is the price received in excess of the costs of producing those units of the good. So there's a producer surplus, a consumer surplus. That's the total value that's created by having these goods being produced in this market, if this market was competitive. But let's take a look at the situation if this market isn't competitive, if there's a monopolist. And remember that that monopolist will produce where the monopoly marginal revenue is equal to the monopoly marginal cost. That gives them a quantity not of 13, but of 9. They take those 9 units to the consumers and say, okay, here's your demand curve, and find that those folks are willing to pay $260. That's what we just did just a minute ago, right? But now let's take a look at the changes in the total value created and the allocation of that value among the producer and the consumers if there's a monopoly in place. There's a definite change in the allocation of value, okay? We know that the profits being generated by this monopoly that go to the monopolist, okay, are a result of the consumers paying higher prices. So the consumers are paying that $260 instead of the $180 that they would pay in a competitive environment. So the consumers are paying a higher price, so the value received above the higher price means that their consumer surplus area is smaller. In fact, it's only the triangle above this green area. The green area used to, if we think of it maybe having been a competitive market and now has become a monopoly, this green area now goes to the producer. But there's more. Remember from chapter 2 that there's this dead weight loss as well. That is, we could have created units that were valued more than it cost to produce those units. That is, units above 9 up to 13. The 10th and 11th and 12th and 13th units all had value to somebody more than the additional cost to produce those, but the monopolist doesn't produce those units because it doesn't pay the monopolist to do so. The monopolist maximizes profits here at Q of 9. If it were to produce the 10th table, it would be producing at costs above the revenues that it would receive. Certainly the price is up there, but remember, if they produce more units, the price of all of the goods would come down. They choose to produce 9 units, and that leads to a dead weight loss that's equal to this area out here. So what changed? Instead of getting the entire area, all of these colored area elements all together in a competitive environment, now we don't get the red area at all. And the portion that had been a consumer surplus here in this green area now shifts over to the producer, and the producer gets to keep more of the value. The monopoly does two things. One, it changes the allocation of value. The monopolist, the producer, gets more, and the consumers get less of the total value that does get created. But it also limits the quantity being produced and therefore limits the opportunity that we had to create even more value out of the resources that we have in our society. That dead weight loss is a loss of efficiency, and the change in allocation then is a change in the social allocation of the benefits of creating these particular goods. Now, a lot of economists will argue that it's that dead weight loss out there that's the real problem of monopoly. We lose the opportunity that we could have had. It's inefficient. Well, if efficiency is all you care about, then you definitely want to have the quantity of 13 units being produced in this particular environment. And with one price to all of 180, you'd have a certain allocation of consumers receiving their consumer surplus and the producers receiving their producer surplus. Having a monopoly does cut back on the total value creation. That is, there is deadweight loss, but there's also a change in the allocation of the value that does get created. More of it goes to the company, less of it goes to the consumer. Now, whether you think that's good or bad depends entirely on whether you're one of the producers or one of the consumers, probably, right? So the allocation is something that economists don't usually focus too much attention on. They look at that deadweight loss out there. But this particular structure for an economy, this monopoly structure, does change the allocation from a competitive structure. Whether that's good or not, you need to apply some sort of value system, which is why in this course we've been talking quite a bit about the Christian values and the themes that we could apply to trying to interpret some of that. Okay? Now, let's take a look again. In competition, one price gets charged to everybody at 180. We create a certain amount of consumer surplus. We create a certain amount of producer surplus. Let's suppose that we do have a monopoly, but let's suppose now instead of that monopolist having to pick a quantity and charge one price to everybody, let's suppose that that monopolist is able to produce a certain number of goods, however many goods they choose to produce, and charge each person, each consumer, the full value that the consumer places on that good. Now remember, in a sense, the fact that there's any consumer surplus at all means that some of the consumers received more value than they actually had to pay for. And whether that's good or not depends on whether you think that the consumer really ought to compensate the folks who made the goods that the consumer values so highly. If the consumer doesn't pay full value for those goods, isn't that in some sense cheating the producer out of the value that the producer is creating? That's why talking about allocation leads us into all kinds of interesting moral discussions. In this particular case, what we're looking at is, suppose that the rules are different. Suppose that in this case, the producer is able to charge the full value that each consumer receives. So the first consumer here, the first table, is sold to somebody who values that table at somewhere in the neighborhood of $430. And the next one, the second table, is sold to somebody who values it at somewhere around $400. And the third one, go vertically up, the third one is valued at somewhere around $380. If the monopolist, the one producer, was able to charge each individual the full value that they received, how many units would the producer produce? The producer would produce the units of the good as long as they were able to sell it to someone, that is, someone valued the table at more than the marginal cost of production. That is, under perfect price discrimination, each individual being charged different prices, the value that they would receive, the monopolist would produce 13 units of the good. Because the value being received, we can see that on the demand curve, is above the cost of production. We see that on the marginal cost curve, all the way out to unit 13. Well, if that's the case, if each of the customers gets charged the amount that they really value the good for, then the marginal revenue, the additional revenue from an additional unit, is the price that we see on that demand curve. In other words, that marginal revenue curve in the case of price discrimination is no longer laying inside off of the demand curve, but it's back on the demand curve, even for this special monopolist who's able to price discriminate. In that case, the marginal revenue equals marginal cost is out there at 13. They produce 13 units, and the area here, which under competition was consumer surplus, now fully accrues to the producer, because the producer is the one who's creating the value, and through price discrimination is able to capture that value for the firm. Is there a change in allocation of value? Absolutely. Okay. There's instead of, compared to the competitive environment, this triangle area going to the consumers, it now fully goes to the producers. The producer is able to capture all of the value that got created. Okay. But take a look. If we were to change the rules of the game to say, no, a monopoly can be a monopoly and charge different prices to every consumer in the marketplace, notice that there's no deadweight loss. There's no inefficiency caused by having this monopolist who's able to price discriminate. There is a difference in how much value the consumers wind up with. They wind up with the goods, which they fully value, and they had to pay the full value of the good, which doesn't necessarily sound unreasonable. Sure, they'd love to pay a lower price, but I'd love to pay $20,000 for a Lamborghini. Just because I'd love to pay a lower price doesn't mean that in any sense someone ought to sell me one for $20,000. Okay. Consumers would always love to receive lower prices. Producers would always love to receive higher prices. in a sense here, if you can charge different prices to different consumers according to the value they place on the goods, okay, we don't suffer that dead weight loss at all under that kind of market structure. Okay? It's just yielding a different allocation of the value created. So this leads us to an interesting set of values questions, right? Okay. In fact, if a firm has the capacity to utilize market power to be able to generate above normal profits, okay, should they? I mean, it's sometimes thought that those big bad firms generating profits is a mark of they're doing evil and bad things. However, what we just saw in the perfect price discrimination case, maybe those firms generating economic profits are an indication that they're actually creating value for the consumers, and there's some way in which that value is not being left in the hands of the consumers, but being put into the hands of the people who created the goods that were valued that highly. Maybe that's not an evil thing, maybe that's actually a good thing. So, sometimes there's this thought that profits are evil. Well, now there's also this thought that, well, profits may be some indication that, God's really happy with our particular business and God is showering blessings, in this case, money, onto this business because they're doing wonderful things. Well, what studying these economic elements of market structure is empowering us to do is to discern better the kinds of conditions that we see going on and make better use of our theological perspectives to be able to evaluate, okay, is what's going on there in this marketplace a lack of love, a lack of concern for your consumer? Are you trying to exploit your consumer for your own benefit by charging higher prices? Or are you actually creating value that the consumer is actually paying for? Is that a lack of love, or is that just us being in relationship together and trying to figure out how to share in the value that God created? Is there an injustice? Well, if to ask the question of whether there's an injustice requires us to ask the question of what a just price would look like. Now, we took that question up a little bit when we talked about wages earlier in the course, but also how about for outputs? Is there a just price for the output? What makes the perfectly competitive price a just price? Okay. Well, and in this justice question, we certainly, can use the tools provided by economics, say, for instance, the inelasticity of demand for some products as an indicator that, okay, there may be some goods that we don't necessarily want there to be the ability to charge very, very high prices for because the people really don't have a true sense of choice to buy or not buy when the alternative is not being able to live. So there are some elements in the conditions that lead to this inelasticity of demand that we can bring ideas of justice toward to help us figure out, is it just or not to charge higher prices for these particular goods? Certainly the issues of freedom. Okay. And again, that question of we are free to do that which is valued by God and by others, and we are free. But what does that mean? Does that mean not violating rules? We can do anything we want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else? Or does that really mean that we're free to create positive benefit for others? Those perspectives on what we mean by that freedom then are perspectives that we can bring to thinking about the economic conditions of these different market structures.